A few knights climbed up on the walls of Jerusalem on the morning of July 15, 1099. They had walked more than 3,000 miles. They had starved, eaten their own horses, and buried half of their friends in foreign soil. Some had turned to cannibalism. They had been walking for 3 years, and now they were in the holiest city on earth, playing music. What happened next was one of the most well-documented massacres in the medieval world. It didn't matter if they were Muslims, Jews, or Eastern Christians. It took 2 days for the killing to end. Latin chroniclers wrote about the killing with pride. One person said that the winners walked through blood that was up to their horses' ankles. Then they walked to the church of the Holy Sepulchre, knelt among the dead, and cried with happiness. Let's look at this terrible and amazing time in history and see how one man's speech started a war that lasted 200 years. Why were the first people to be hurt in a march for Christ not Muslims, but Jewish neighbors who lived across the street? How did 13,000 half-dead people with no water and singing no food take a fortress that seemed impossible to break into? And why does this war, which was lost, failed, and forgotten for hundreds of years, still shape the world you live in? The borders you see on the map, the wars you hear about in the news, the President of the United States saying crusade when he sent troops to the Middle East after September 11th, and Osama bin Laden saying Crusaders when he declared war on the whole Western world. On the morning of July 15, 1099, everything started here on the walls of Jerusalem. To understand why tens of thousands of Europeans left everything behind, including music, and walked into the desert, you need to know what their world was like. Western Europe was a backwater of civilization by the 11th century. The Islamic caliphates that stretched from Spain to Central Asia were the center of the world. They connected Indian mathematics, Chinese silk, Persian astronomy, and Greek philosophy into one place where people could share ideas and trade goods. Most European aristocrats couldn't even read their own names, but Baghdad's House of Wisdom was translating Aristotle. Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, was the biggest and richest city in the Christian world. Mechanical golden lions, hot baths, and libraries that had been around for 1,000 years. Europe didn't have any of this. It was a broken-up patchwork of feudal domains that were cut off from major trade routes, economically stunted, and technologically behind. Goods from the East went through 10 middlemen and cost 10 times as much. Material culture was so bad that even kings lived in conditions that would have made a Roman 1,000 years earlier feel dirty. But Europe had a lot of armed men with nothing to do. The feudal system had made a whole class of younger sons who were trained for war, armed to the teeth, and had no land. Only the oldest child got the inheritance. When primogeniture was in place, the other people had 2 choices: the church or the sword. Thousands of minor nobles fought each other, raided villages, and made life miserable for everyone around them as they traveled through the countryside. The church had tried to stop this violence. The Peace of God movement said that it was wrong to attack priests and peasants. God's Truth said that fighting music was not allowed on holy days. But that wasn't enough. Europe was full of its own warriors. Jerusalem had been in Muslim hands since 637, which was over 400 years ago. For most of that time, Christians could visit the city and its holy places. In 109, the Fatimid Caliph Hakim ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was the most holy place in all of Christianity. According to Christian belief, this is where Christ was buried and then came back to life. They raised the church up to its foundations. It was rebuilt decades later, but not as well as before. But Europe never got over it. Things got worse after that. In 1071, the Seljuk Turks, who were nomads from Central Asia and had just adopted a militarized form of Islam, invaded the Middle East. They beat the Byzantine army and took the emperor, Romanos IV Dionys, prisoner. It was a disaster on par with the fall of Rome. The Seljuks took over almost all of Anatolia in just 10 years. Land that had been Greek for more than 1,000 years. The road that Christians walked to Jerusalem for hundreds of years became very dangerous. Byzantium didn't die, but it was hurt badly. Palace coups, civil wars, and the loss of one province after another plagued the empire for the next 20 years. Alexios Stinos, a skilled military leader, took the throne in 1081 and was able to stop the collapse. He beat the Pachoon in the Balkans, hired Varangians from Scandinavia, and made the borders more stable. However, the Seljuks still controlled Anatolia. The Byzantine Empire's heart was Anatolia, which is now part of Turkey. Its main source of soldiers, grain, and taxes. Alexius couldn't get it back on his own. He wrote to Pope Urban II in 1095. He needed professional soldiers, a few thousand trained men. to help him get back land that had been lost. He didn't say anything about Jerusalem or Holy War. He wanted to hire soldiers. What he got was something that no one could have guessed. Pope Urban II had his own problems. He was in a power struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor, who ruled Rome and put an antipope named Clement III on the papal throne. Urban couldn't even get into his own city. He was going from town to town in France, building support through his sermons. He was a great speaker, and he was winning, but he needed something more. The letter from Alexios was just what he needed. On November 27, 1095, in the French city of Clermont, Urban stood in front of a crowd of clergy and nobles and gave one of the most important speeches in history. The exact words are lost, but all historians agree on the effect. He didn't say anything about helping Byzantium. He talked about Jerusalem. He talked about how Eastern Christians were suffering. He talked about Muslims desecrating holy sites, like the Church of the Holy Sailor, the Jordan River, and the land where Christ walked. He painted a picture of holy ground being walked on by people who don't believe, and then he made a deal that no medieval Christian could turn down. Anyone who picked up the cross and walked to Jerusalem would get a plenary indulgence, which meant that all of their sins, not just the ones they had already committed, would be forgiven. People who were really afraid of going to hellfire didn't see this as a political move. It was a sure way to get to heaven. The crowd screamed, "Dio's fault," as the music played. It is God's will. It should be noted that this happened in French Clermont, so they probably yelled in Old French. "Dieu left." People ripped their clothes and sewed the strips into crosses on their tunics. What Urban did was a big deal. There has never been a concept of holy war in Christianity. Even soldiers who fought for a good cause were seen as sinners. After the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the winners had to do penance in church for the blood they had shed, and all of a sudden, killing was not only okay, it was holy. A man could kill people from Jerusalem to Constantinople and still get to heaven with a clean soul. But there was another layer that people today often miss. It had only been a year since the first year. Medieval thought was full of apocalyptic expectations. The Bible says that before the end of the world, a last king would bring all of Christendom together. Then the Antichrist would show up after that. Christ would come back. Many Crusaders truly and passionately believed that by bringing the Eastern and Western churches back together and taking back Jerusalem, they were fulfilling biblical prophecy. They weren't just going to war, they were speeding up the end of the world with music. They were turning into people from the last chapter of the Bible. Urban set the date for the trip to leave on August 15, 1096. The Feast of the Virgin Mary's Assumption is a holy day for a holy mission. The 9-month lead time gave the nobles time to get their estates mortgaged, stock up on supplies, and get their retinues ready. But the people didn't wait. Urban had thought that the military would be well organized, but the speech at Clermont set off a wave that he couldn't stop. A charming monk named Peter the Hermit began preaching all over France and Germany months before the real crusade began. He said that Christ had appeared to him in a vision and told him to let the faithful to Jerusalem. He had what he called a divine letter. As proof, scholars are still arguing about whether or not he ever went to the Holy Land, but his audience didn't care. His words sparked something deep inside. Tens of thousands of people, including peasants, beggars, women, children, minor knights, criminals, and others, sewed crosses onto their clothes and left for the East without a supply train, maps, military training, or much money. They had faith in the Pope's word that God would keep them safe. Before they even left Europe, there was violence. As the music played, the mobs moved through the Rhineland and attacked Jewish communities in Speyer, Worms, and Meitjes, and Cologne. The reasoning was simple and scary. Why walk 3,000 meters to fight Christ's enemies when they are right here? Many Jews lost their lives. Some people were given the choice of baptism or death. A lot of people chose to die. It was the worst outbreak of violence against Jews in Europe up to that point, and it set a pattern that would last for hundreds of years. Things got worse in Hungary. The People's Crusade did not move in a single line. There were waves of groups of crusaders all over Europe. One advanced group had already gone through Semlin and fought with the locals. It lost 16 men, and their armor was hung from the walls of the castle as a warning. When Peter's followers saw this, they got angry right away. Fight with a local merchant over a pair of shoes was the last straw. The crowd came down on the town. Albert of Aachen says that 4,000 Hungarians died. The army of Hungary got ready. Some of the groups that followed Peter were completely wiped out. Some people barely made it across the border. People who made it to Constantinople found a Byzantine empire that didn't know what to do with them. Alexios had asked for soldiers who were good at their jobs instead. are starving. Out of control, Morg showed up and started stealing from the suburbs right away. He got them across the Bosphorus as quickly as he could, right into Seljuk land. The Turks didn't wait long. A group of 6,000 People's Crusaders took over the fortress of Zirikgordon. But when they got inside, they found that there was no water source. The Seljuks surrounded them and waited for 8 days. The People's Crusaders drank the blood of their horses and their own pee when they finally gave up. Those who agreed to become Muslims were sold into slavery. People who said no were killed. One of the leaders didn't just change. He told the Turks he would help them fight their fellow Christians. About 20,000 people in the main body set out to march on the Seljuk capital. But they walked right into an ambush. The Turkish cavalry, which was well organized, killed them all. Only about 3,000 people were able to get away. Peter the Hermit lived. He went back to Constantinople to talk about supplies and missed the massacre. He later joined the real crusade as if nothing had happened. The people's fight was over. It had killed thousands of Hungarian civilians, thousands of Byzantine subjects, thousands of German Jews, and tens of thousands of its own members. The Seljuks had lost almost no one, and Jerusalem was still 1,000 miles away, firmly in Muslim hands. The real crusade began in the late summer of 1096. There wasn't just one army. There were several groups from all over Europe, each led by a powerful lord who didn't trust his allies any more than he did his enemies. The Lotharingian army was led by Godfrey of Bonn, Duke of Lorraine. He was so dedicated to the cause that he sold his family's castle to pay for the trip. The Italian Normans were led by Bohemond of Toronto, a Norman warlord whose father had tried to take over the Byzantine Empire just 12 years before. Raymond of Toulouse, the richest and oldest of the Crusade leaders, led the Provenal force, and several others. He thought he was the rightful leader of the expedition. Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, Hugh of Varandois, the French king's brother, who the Pope kicked out of the church for being married to 2 women at the same time. They led between 50,000 and 70,000 people, including about 5,000 mounted knights, who were the most powerful military force of the time. Alexios told all the leaders to swear an oath when they got to Constantinople. Byzantium would get back any land that was taken back from the Muslims. The request made sense. These used to be Byzantine lands, but knights who had sold their homes and buried their friends along the way didn't want to fight for a foreign emperor. They couldn't move though. Without supplies from Byzantium, they all swore one by one. The Crusaders crossed into Anatolia, and even though they were all over the place, they caught the Seljuks at the perfect time. The Turkish Sultanate was torn apart by fights between its own members. The Seljuk army was destroyed by the combined Crusader force at the Battle of Turum, one of the few times in the history of the Crusades that an army won in the open field. After that, Antioch came. The siege went on for 8 months. It was one of the most violent parts of the whole campaign. The city was a stronghold with walls that were covered in hundreds of towers. The troops inside stayed strong. The people outside the Crusaders were hungry after eating their horses. They ate their pack animals. Some sources talk about extreme ways to stay alive. Hunger raised the last lines between what was acceptable and what was unthinkable, and the bodies of the enemy became what they should never have been. The camp was hit by disease every night. People left. They finally got into the city by bribing a guard with music to open the gate of one tower. But a huge Seljuk relief army showed up within days and surrounded the people who were besieging them. The Crusaders were stuck in a city they had just looted. But something amazing happened at the worst possible time. Peter Bartholomew, a monk, said he had a vision that showed him where the Holy Lance was, the same spear that pierced Christ's side on the cross, buried under a church in Antioch. They dug. They discovered a piece of iron. It didn't matter if it was planted, real, or if anyone really believed it. The effect was shocking. The Crusaders, who were starving and full of faith, marched out of the gates and attacked the Seljuk army. They came out on top. The attack was so crazy that the relief force didn't see it coming and ran away. The siege was over. The Crusaders would not give Antioch back to Byzantium. Bohemond said it was his. The alliance with Constantinople, which was weak from the start, was broken beyond repair from now on. The Crusaders were on their own. The Crusaders had been marching for 3 years when they got to the walls of Jerusalem in June 1099 of the first group. There were probably 12,000 to 13,000 left, including about 1,300 knights. They were tired, thirsty, and aware that they were running out of time. The city was ready for them. Ikar Adwa, the Fatimid governor, had done a lot of planning. He kicked all the Christians out of the city to stop the kind of betrayal that had led Antioch, and he put poison in the wells outside the walls. He kept a lot of grain and water inside. He put 400 light cavalry in place to attack groups of Crusaders looking for food. He also knew that a relief army from Egypt was already on its way. He just had to hold on. Jerusalem was a stronghold. Steep ravines protected the east and south sides, making them almost impossible to attack. The only ways in were from the north and southwest, and these were the most well-protected: a deep ditch and 2 walls. The whole Crusader army could only cover half a mile of wall. The first attack on June 13th went horribly wrong. They had almost none without siege equipment. They climbed the northern wall with ladders and raw courage. They ran over the outer ditch, got to the main wall, and were pushed back with a lot of casualties. Their lesson was clear. They needed catapults, battering rams, and siege towers, but the hills around Jerusalem were empty. The Fatimids had cut down every tree for miles around. 6 Christian ships came to the port of Jaffa on June 17th. They brought food, water, rope, nails, and skilled carpenters. It was a lifeline, but an Egyptian fleet quickly closed off the harbor. The sailors took apart their own ships and burned the hulls instead of letting them fall into enemy hands. There still wasn't enough material. Even with the ship timber, Crusader parties had to go 60 miles north to the Samaria forests, where they used the forced labor of local people to bring back the logs. Things got worse quickly, and the camp water became a big problem. Men had to walk to the River Jordan to fill their water skins. The leaders fought over who would be in charge of Jerusalem. Morale fell apart when word came that the Egyptian army would be in Jerusalem. In a month, despair reached its peak. The leaders of the Crusade told people to walk barefoot around the city walls on July 8th, a deliberate reference to the biblical siege of Jericho. When the walls fell down, when trumpets sounded, the Fatimid defenders laughed as they watched from the ramparts, but the ritual didn't work on the walls. It worked on the men. The leaders who were fighting finally made up. The tired soldiers called on their last reserves of strength. The building of the siege engines, which had been going very slowly, suddenly sped up. The chroniclers say that even kids and old women carried stones and wood on July 9th. But 3 of Boron's men did something that the defenders didn't see coming. They took apart their siege tower, which was as tall as a 5-story building, and put it back together in a different spot along the northern wall. In just one night, this was a part of the wall that the Fatimids had left less fortified. They had planned to build the tower in full view of the defenders for weeks, just so the defenders would focus their preparations in the wrong place. When the sun came up, the defenders saw that the tower was no longer there, and that it had already moved to another part of the wall. Iftikhar used all of his available reserves to strengthen the exposed area. But it was too late. The last attack started on July 13th. A huge battering ram hit the outer wall for 2 days while arrows rained down on it non-stop. When it finally got through, it stopped the siege tower behind it from moving. In a moment of desperate irony, the Crusaders set fire to their own battering ram. The defenders had been trying to burn this machine for days to clear the way. Raymond of Tulis was losing on the southern front. The tower he was using for a siege was broken. His camp was on fire, and his men were talking about retreating. The only thing that kept them there was the news from the north wall. The breakthrough happened on the northern wall in the afternoon of July 15th. A few knights were able to get to the fortifications right from the siege tower. Godfrey was one of the first. The Fatimids quickly tried to retake the wall, but the knights held their ground long enough for others to join them. Some went up the ladder, and some went through the tower. The flow got bigger. The army rushed into the city when the Crusaders got to the Damascus gate and opened it from the inside. Iftikhar, who was watching from the citadel, saw his defense fall apart. He made Raymond of Tulis an offer. You can have the treasures of the citadel if you promise to leave the city safely. Raymond agreed. The governor and his guard made it out of Jerusalem alive. They were some of the last to do it. What happened next was not the usual violence of a medieval sack. 3 years of pain, hunger, and the strong belief that God had given them this city made it even worse. The Crusaders killed everyone. The Jews were forced into their synagogue, which was then set on fire. Muslims who had sought safety in the Aqsa mosque were killed. Eastern Christians, the very people Urban said he was freeing, were killed along with everyone else. The Crusaders couldn't tell them apart, and in their excitement, they didn't even try. Latin writers wrote about what they saw in a strange mix of horror and triumph. There were so many dead bodies on the streets that they were blocked. Of the smell stayed for weeks, and those same writers wrote about how the winners, still covered in blood, walked to the church of the Holy Sepulchre and cried with joy they had kept their promise. Christianity came back to Jerusalem, but it was a whole different story to hold it then. Most of the Crusaders just went back home. The promise was kept. Their sins were forgiven. Why stay? But some people stayed on the land that had been taken. 4 states were created by the Crusaders: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. These were the first European colonies that were not in Europe, a small part of the eastern Mediterranean coast where a few thousand Western Christians ruled over a much larger population. Muslims, Jews, and Christians from the east. 3 sides have Muslim powers that are hostile. On the 4th side, the sea, which was their only way to get to Europe. Acre, a port city where everything went through, became the capital. More soldiers, pilgrims, money, and goods. These states have been getting smaller since day one. They lost land one at a time. He asked Europe for help, and each time he did, a new crusade started. There were 8 of them over the course of 2 centuries. None of them were able to do as well as the first. The Templar Tower in Acre was the last Crusader fortress to fall in 1291. It killed both defenders and attackers. It was over 200 years after Urban's speech at Clement the First Crusade reached its goal. The only one of all those who came after would. Christians would only have Jerusalem for less than 90 years. The Crusades that came after would get bigger and less useful. But the First Crusade changed Europe for good. It made Europe see things differently. Europeans had thought of themselves as the center of civilization for hundreds of years. The Crusades showed the truth. They were on the outside of it. The Islamic world was richer, smarter, and more advanced. The realization was both humiliating and life-changing. Arabic numbers, windmills, medical knowledge, and Aristotle's works. It all came to Europe through trade with the East. The First Crusade planted the seed of an idea that would last longer than every castle and kingdom in Europe, that Europe could project power beyond its own borders. For 100 years later, the age of empires would begin. But the logic of that age was already clear on the streets of Acre. For the Islamic world, the Crusades were a small part of a much longer history that was forgotten for hundreds of years. It wasn't until the 19th century, when Europeans were colonizing, that they were called the first Western invasion. That story is still going strong. When Osama bin Laden said he was going to war with Jews and Crusaders, he was using a metaphor from 900 years ago. And it landed because the wound was still fresh when it opened again. The Crusades did not end with either a win or a loss. They were so tired, and the world had changed so much that neither side could recognize it anymore.